curious, have you ever known someone who's gone missing? If so, what's the story? Just Dude said. A girl that transferred into her high school around 10th grade just up and disappeared one weekend without any real trace. Many weeks later, it turned out she had left town to meet a guy she met on AOL. See kids, AOL used to. Classic story, he was much older, she was underage. They actually stayed together and the girl's family ended up coming around to accepting it. Really weird. What made it even weirder for me is that I was not friends with this girl, but she lived in my neighborhood. Years later, my mom had become friends with the girl's mom and my mom found out that the girl told her parents for months that she was on the phone or IMing me anytime she was talking to the older man. Her parents eventually realized she and I were never communicating, but since we were the same age, I was unknowingly her cover story for months. To this day, I've still never had an actual conversation with this girl. Really weird finding out that I had been her fake boyfriend all those years prior. I am a solipsist said. I had a student that had this happen with a family member. It was rough trying to lie to keep hope after the first couple days given I used to live near the area he was hiking and knew that if you weren't found within the same day it was extremely rare to survive. It's really important to have other people with you when you go out hiking and keep with the group. In her uncle's instance we was a very competent hiker, but got a bit brash and didn't want to wait for the group he was with and went forward alone. It took over a week to find his body. As per usual he'd fallen and wasn't able to get help. I think a lot of people get used to just walking around local parks, nature preserves and think hiking out in the middle of nowhere is like that. Stan Yelnats 3 said. I had an employee, Jason, that had worked for us for 6 years, 4 of those directly reporting to me. He was a pretty good worker, and a nice guy. One day, a police officer came to our office and said he was looking for Jason. Jason was scheduled off. The officer said, Jason has a warrant for an unpaid traffic violation, no big deal. He was just wanted to come down to the court building and make arrangements to take care of the legal issue. The next day, we told Jason what had happened. He asked me if he could clock out right then and go down and settle it immediately. I said sure. So he went. Later that same day, he came back to work saying it was all taken care of. Maybe a month went by, and then another officer showed up looking for Jason. The next time Jason was scheduled I told him another cop came by. He said he had worked out a payment plan for the fine and had forgotten to make the payment. He again asked me if he could leave to take care of it. He left. I never saw him again, ever. We called the jails in the area to see if they had him, no. We eventually got in touch with his ex. She said that she was looking for him too and hadn't seen him. To this day I don't really know what happened or where he went. Online searches have not turned up anything. He has a pretty common name so it's like a needle in a haystack. It seemed like a simple traffic fine was hardly a reason to abandon a good job, but we may never know. Gustinos Bost said. I went to the same elementary school as Michael Dunahy. He was kidnapped off the playground and still not found to this day. I remember after it happened every parent showed up to walk the entire school of kids home. I also remember running ahead of the pack for whatever reason and all the parents were screaming at me to get back. They were terrified. Max 333,221 said. My brother's middle school teacher. He just didn't show up to school one day, which was very unusual. The school scrambled to find a substitute for him, because they had no notice. We had a whole school meeting like 2 days later when he was officially missing where they told us all about it. He left the house that morning as usual, according to his wife later said. He was never seen again. Many search parties were organized, and people looked for months, but they never found him. He is still officially missing today. Sir Raimundo Rocket said. Half-brother. He went missing after going out on the lake with a friend's boat and his girlfriend. It had started raining and storming and the boat tipped over. His girlfriend made it back to shore. He didn't. They took 2 days to find him. They dragged the lake for his body. He was eventually found dead, washed up on the shore somewhere along the tree line of the lake. Not Ned Skneebly said. Worked at a company where I got real close to the 2 owners. Very odd relationship but it worked. They had a third business partner who left due to mental illness. He'd pop in every so often and cash a check. Despite selling his shares, ownerships etc., they still gave him a fairly decent wage for doing nothing. Chill guy, name was Simon. Long story short, we all went to Amsterdam for a few days to let off steam after a grueling quarter. Had a hangover-esque night out, woke up to no Simon. Searched high and low, informed the local police after 24 hours and booked a few extra nights in hopes he'd turn up again. Never did. Booked another 2 nights, still no luck. Left for home and informed the SO family and opened inquiries with the police back in the UK. 3 weeks after returning, Simon's wife received a voicemail from a private number, muffled along the lines of "in trouble, can't come home, they're onto me." This led to some extreme days of questioning at a local drunk tank, but nothing heard from after a further 6 weeks. Case closed, no new evidence etc. Tried to appeal and got shut down. Dude just left. Clearly didn't die, pre-creepy voicemail, but hasn't been heard of since. 2 kids as well. Such a shame. Really booked me out for a while. One Way Rabbit said. Had a co-worker employee in high school who went missing for 3 days. Turned out he'd gone out for a walk without telling anyone. A tree had fallen on him and he'd been unable to free himself. He was dehydrated and obviously shaken when they found him, but he recovered and came back to work a few days later. M. Nichols 45 said. I can definitely see this. When I was 12 or 13, I visited some relatives in backcountry Virginia. I took their dogs out to go explore the wilderness behind the property. Well, needless to say, after about 2-3 hours I became lost. I ended up just letting the dogs lead the way and found a house and frantically pounded on their door. Nobody answered, but after walking towards the road it looked somewhat familiar and realized I was only 2-3 miles from their house. Was probably gone for about 8 hours. Out with the keyboard said. My Nana and Papa, 10 years ago almost to the day. They went missing on July 30th, 2011. The whole family got together for a barbecue and they just never showed up. We spent days looking for them but never found anything. Some kind stranger spotted their crashed truck at the bottom of an incline 3 weeks later. From what the police told us, they misjudged a corner whilst coming down a dirt road up in the mountains. Nana got out of the truck to try and direct Papa. The edge of the road gave way, and all of them went down the mountain. According to the autopsies, Nana died from internal bleeding a few hours after the crash. Papa survived a couple of days longer. While he'd been injured in the crash, his precise cause of death was never determined. The family, myself included, thinks he died of a broken heart. They'd been married for more than 60 years by the time they died. Papa probably couldn't imagine a life without Nana. The only bright spot in all of this was their dog, Sassy. She'd been in the truck with them when they crashed. Somehow an elderly schnauzer managed to survive the crash in 3 weeks alone in the Idaho backcountry. She lived out the rest of her days loved and treasured by Nana and Papa's eldest daughter. Out with the keyboard said. Nana and Papa were 2 of the kindest, most welcoming people I ever had the pleasure of meeting. I wasn't actually related to them. My mom was a friend of their daughter-in-law, but that never mattered to them. I was their bonus grandkid, and they treated me as such. There was always a plate for me on the table at dinner time and a present under the tree with my name on it at Christmas. Their door was always open. For me, a kid from a royally fucked up family, they were something out of a fairy tale. They loved me, no questions asked, and I love them just as much. It's been a decade now and I still miss them terribly. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to reminisce, Op. The 91 Sound said. A girl the same age as me, around 8 or 9 at the time, and the town over. At this time there had been serial kidnappings of young girls that were, at that point, unsolved. Eventually, some remains of some of the victims were found. It was all over the news, and there was a lot of fear locally, even to the point where I remember being kept indoors having to stick closer to home than I would have otherwise. My parents were teachers in the neighboring town, and it really hit our family when a girl was taken who went to the school my stepfather taught at. He was crushed. He talks a lot about how fun and outgoing she was, despite not being in his class. I think it was only really at that point that my kid brain really understood the weight of what was going on. She was missing for a while, I think, several days or weeks, and I think everyone assumed that any update would be a tragic one. Well, the girl escaped. She managed to free herself, stayed calm and quiet, and took off running out of the dude's car as soon as he was in a public place. Explained who she was, and ended up leading police back to him. Pretty sure the piece of shit died in prison for the sick things he did to so many young children, but I make a point of not investigating online. The 91 Sound said, I met her a few summers later at a church summer camp. It took me a little time piecing together who she was by her first name and her school, and her mentioning that she thought she knew my stepdad. My parents told me very sternly not to let on that I recognized her, which I wouldn't have anyway. But I was just floored by how confident, friendly and positive she was, exactly as I had heard of her before the ordeal. I was so amazed by that level of strength, that she could come out of it and be so normal. I'm not saying there was no damage done. I don't know how you survive something like that and don't carry scars, but she just embodied strength to me. Seriously, just a joy to be around and well liked by everyone, it seemed. I actually thought of her randomly a year or so ago and looked her up on social media. She is continuing to be an advocate against trafficking and has really done some amazing things in the world. I am so glad to see her doing well. The girl is a force, and I have been rooting for her my whole life. Caffeinated HBIC said, I can't get very detailed, but my friend's teenage son went missing. The son was a sports star, great kid, had scholarships to his college of choice, was in the top 10% of the student body, etc. He was gone for a week, and the whole community really rallied to look for him. Unfortunately, it came to light that 2 of his friends were actually sick shits. He had become a star student when they went to high school, but his 2 friends from elementary school didn't. They had gotten increasingly more jealous of his loving parents, stable finances, scholarships, grades and praise, until they decided to kill him. They had planned their friend's murder, carried it out, hidden his body, then helped look for him, all while knowing he was dead. Their Facebook messages to one another revealed the truth after about a week, and it wasn't long until his body was found. KennyBoy019 said, I've got a couple. My mom's ex-husband disappeared off the face of the earth for over a year and was declared dead. Turned out he'd been jumped by some guys for his car and left bloodied on the side of the road. Woke up and didn't remember who he was. Was in and out of shelters until something jogged a bit of his memory and he got in contact with his then-girlfriend. Like he remembered her house but nothing else. Apparently he had a major brain injury when he was a kid that didn't really get treated that resulted in a big chunk of his brain dying. So when he got jumped it scrambled what was left. Another was a kid I knew who went missing up in Washington. He was riding his bike on some big multi-week trip and just disappeared. His bike was found with all his gear intact but no sign of him. His remains were found about a year later in the middle of nowhere and something like 5 miles from his bike. Amble1216 said, about 15 years ago, my uncle drove up from Arizona with his 3 kids to Illinois where my family and grandma lived. He stayed the weekend at my grandma's, and was supposed to stay another week before heading back to Arizona, but then left in the middle of the night on a Sunday without a word. He did, however, leave a note saying he wouldn't be back and my grandma was to take care of the kids. None of us, not even his kids or ex-wife, heard or saw anything about him until 2 years ago when my mom found him on Facebook. Apparently he moved to the Philippines with some Filipino woman and started a new family there. Loquacious Avenger said, several years ago, a friend's boyfriend went on a hike in the Cascade Mountains. It was late September, which a time of year where the weather conditions can flip at a moment's notice. His hiking buddy said that one minute they were walking and talking, then all of a sudden he looked behind him and realized he was alone. We organized search parties for weeks but no trace was ever found. The only thing that makes sense is that the guy lost his footing and slid down the mountain but no one could find evidence of a slide or damaged vegetation. I still wonder if the guy chose to disappear in order to avoid some kind of debt. Personionsuus said, College Town, the favorite bartender. The story goes, he was leaving the local grocery store and noticed a guy, who he thought was one of his regulars, trying to hitch a ride. Even as the guy approached, Squally said he realized it wasn't the guy. But it was too late. He hopped in the passenger seat and stuck a gun in his ribs. Told him to keep driving. 5 days, and a few states later, the guy pulled off the highway and drove for hours into the mountains of TN. Stopped to take a piss and didn't come back. Squally drove car back to the last gas station he saw. Insane. Golden Fox said, I used to airsoft when I was a kid, which in my area meant just going out into the woods with a bunch of friends and relative strangers to shoot at each other with BB guns. Teams are established and you wander around until you find some enemies and then you shoot them. At one point, someone realized that one of my friends was missing, so we called off the game and began searching for him. He and his brother were out there that day, so it was, hey, game is paused, we have to find one of the Smith kids. We encountered some enemies and yelled to them that the game was paused, Smith kid was missing and we had to find him. Enemies said okay, wandered off in some other direction to look for him. Enemies encountered some of their enemies, my teammates, and explained that someone from our team was missing and had to be found. In this game of telephone, no one realized that the missing person was in this new group of my teammates. So he ended up on a search for himself. Thiepway said, "This was many years ago, but I had a cousin that lived in a remote area of the Western US. He had just graduated high school and was working a job putting up fences in a mountainous area. The crew had pretty much finished for the day and had gone back to the campsite when my cousin wandered off from the rest of the group. He did not return. Despite months of searching, no one was able to find him, and eventually my family had services and placed a marker in his honor at the cemetery. Nearly 8 years later, a hunter came across his remains. He was under a tree and his hands were up behind his head in laid back position and his wallet was underneath. They assumed that he had gotten high or drunk and fell asleep only to succumb to hypothermia at the high elevation. It provided closure for his parents and they did inter his remains where the marker had been placed, but we all endured years of agony, dread and frustration through this event." Accurate Quail 6978 said, "My sister went missing for 25 years. My family are idiot foreigners who didn't know what a missing persons report is. My brother would always occasionally look for her online. He found a website that has photos of unclaimed bodies. He identified her sister by her chipped tooth, scars, small tattoo that only the siblings knew about, and general facial appearance. She had been raped and strangled to death at age 21. We finally buried her. If your loved one is missing, look on unclaimed body websites. There are many of them with photos and photos of any markings." Large Possible said, "This friend of mine's kid went missing 7 years ago now. He was an artist about 17 years old. He was on his way out west, I think to go to school maybe, or to travel before school, I can't remember. But I watched her Facebook posts for the next 6 years as she just slowly unravels. She was looking for her son, traveling all over the country, hiring private investigators, hiring various firms, spending time in homeless encampments for teenagers. About 2 years ago she was posting these really long rambling posts about how dare people tell her to get over it and move on. Didn't they know her heart was broken? People that she thought were family would never give up like this on her son, and then they found his bones. And now she's like totally returning to a normal, posting about normal stuff. Edit, removed a detail." Pissistiorytophile said, "I love Tajikistan, but it's just unsafe. Especially if you're a girl. There's at least one kid being murdered each day. You never hear about it on the news because the government controls everything. They have a list of lesbian and gay people that are out. It's severely anti-Muslim, which is ridiculous because we have about 9 million people and almost every single Tajik is Muslim. If you're working you can't wear a hijab and it's recommended that you just wear scarves the cultural way. Men under 60 can't have beards. If you get heard talking bad about the government you get jailed and tortured. If you're related to someone who badmouths the government you can get jailed even if you didn't do anything. If you do literally anything that the government doesn't like you can get jailed and tortured. I don't even know if we have any sexual abuse, child abuse laws because no one ever gets punished. You could yell out loud that you raped someone and no one would do anything to you. It's such a shame that the government is horrible because it really is a pretty country and the culture is amazing. If you ever travel there make sure to not stay out at night and go to the safer cities." Pissistiorytophile said, "It's understandable seeing as no one is allowed to badmouth the government and barely anyone knows of its existence. It's been going through some tough times. After the USSR broke up it had a really heavy impact on Tajikistan, and then soon after that we had a civil war that lasted for years. Adding those to the fact that the government is absolutely terrible, problems with thieves and murderers, a lack of enforcing laws, and lots of nepotism and cozying up to Putin, it has all led to it deteriorating. It makes me sad to see my beautiful country and its people in ruins. People can't even get good paying jobs because the economy is trash, and no one can get a good education because the schools are terrible. Buying a large pizza from Domino's could pay for a family's food for 2 weeks. We don't have good healthcare and there are tons of disabled kids that aren't getting the support they need. To make it even worse, the president is preparing his son for taking over. No one can refuse and we can't be mad. I'd love to take my friends there and see my family again when it's safer. Zunky Monkey said. My brother-in-law's mother went missing for about a month after finding out she had terminal inoperable cancer. She called one day saying I'm alive, safe, and on my way home. No one knows where she went, what she did, who she saw, or anything. She took the specifics of the trip to her grave. One of my coworkers went missing for 3 days. Turns out his brother's friends thought it would be funny to slip him acid. They locked him in a closet for 3 days while it wore off. Apparently he went psycho and started screaming about some poet. Applejella Cloud said. I went missing for 3 hours a little over 4 years ago. I was taken at gunpoint from my job and raped. I thankfully was able to convince the guy I wouldn't call the police. The cops had gone to my work with dogs to try to find me. They tried to track my phone, but the phone tower that was 1 block away from where I was taken to was too busy from high call traffic, so my phone incorrectly pinned 20 minutes away. I was able to not be murdered, but I fully believed I was going to be killed the whole time. And I thought to myself, this is how missing people happen in movies. I'm about to be on a poster. I still feel bad for my friends and family who sat in limbo for 3 hours wondering if they'd ever see me again. My rapist got 36 years in prison. He got a higher sentencing because I was 5 months pregnant at the time. My daughter and I are fine now. I go to lots of therapy, so I'm alright. Funktastic said. Girl used to hang out at the same park I did. Packed urban area, immigrant community, she was just another face in the crowd for me. My friend tried dating her at some point and brought her to my parents' house once. I have an old photo of the two of them. At one point she disappeared. As I mentioned, immigrant community, everyone knows each other's business and there were a ton of rumors. No one had seen her for months. Her mom used to wander the neighborhood looking for her. She was like a ghost. Work, come home, look for her. One day the girl appeared with her mom. Not much in the way of an explanation, just one day walking down the street with her mom. Eventually the official party line became that she shacked up with a drug dealer or was kidnapped by a drug dealer depending on who you ask. Supposedly in a different part of the city. I was on the phone with my buddy at some point and he hit her on the line. Her manner of speaking changed drastically to American slang and she sounded mighty gangster. I told my friend not to call me when he was with her anymore because she was insufferable. Later another friend hooked up with her. He didn't know the whole disappearing story but said that something seemed off about her. He mentioned that she had a very visceral reaction to certain sexual positions and refused to discuss it. He respected her wishes but she never told him what's what. He just had to adjust after the fact. She died some years later. I don't think we'll ever know the full story. Yumayaki said. My grandfather? He was a deadbeat dad, drinking all his money and making my mother and grandma suffer a lot. He was violent and used to cheat on my grandma with several women. One day he didn't come after work to the house for about 15 years. Turns out he had won a lottery prize during the 70s and moved to Brazil without telling anybody. My grandma only got a letter a year later saying that she should meet him in Brazil, but my grandma ignored him and married the man she spent her whole life with. Funny enough, he came back during the 90s completely broke and with a debt with some Brazilian mafia dudes. My mom told him to beat it and he threatened us to sell the house unless we welcomed him back in the family. Little did he know that my grandma actually bought back the house from the bank, so he spent the rest of his short remaining life as a homeless man. Ellers Danlos Sucks said. I had a classmate in junior high who arrived mid-year. She was the only child of a single mother. My best friend and I got to know her well, but she kept her distance from everyone else. A couple months later, she came to school crying. Her mom told her that morning they had to move again when she got home from school that day. I was a naive kid. It didn't occur to me this was all off somehow. I just found it strange they were leaving again so quickly and without warning, but mostly I was sad. Then a few years later, one of those National Missing Children postcards came in the mail. I about fell over to see my old friend. Her first name matched but the last did not. It all came together instantly. I was shaking for hours, then I picked up the phone and called the hotline. I don't know if it helped at all, but I gave all the info I could that I hoped would bring more leads, school details, the names of our teachers, timelines, etc. Edit because it's hotline, not howling. I hate autofill. Caberlin said. When I was in middle school, I had a best guy friend. He was the class clown. We were stand partners for orchestra, and he always made me laugh. We ended up going to different high schools, though, because of redistricting, so we lost contact. I never forgot about him, though. Last time I saw him, my high school orchestra had a performance evaluation at his school. He still played, so I got to smile and wave at him. Next year, he went missing. His car was found abandoned, but a few weeks later, they found his body. Turns out he committed suicide by throwing himself in front of a truck on the road.